So, in this module, we're going to talk about the Force. If you're at all familiar with the Star Wars universe, you know that the concept of the Force is key, and Star Wars CCG is infused with this concept through and through. The idea of the Force is represented in the basic structure of the game. Basically, as a Jedi wields the Force, so do you as a Star Wars CCG player wield your cards. So first of all the cards which you have not played to the table yet are called units of Force. Some of these cards make up what is called your life force, which is what keeps you in the game. Once you run out of life force, you lose the game. So rather than winning by achieving a particular objective, you win by making your opponent run out of cards in their life force. And there are different ways that you can make that happen, which we'll discuss in later modules. Now, I said that only some of your force is your life force. Your life force specifically consists of 3 piles, which are shown here in this diagram. The reserve deck, the force pile, and the used pile. Something very key to note to the left here, cards in your hand are not part of your life force. They're outside of this larger box of life force, right? And so this creates a very interesting element of resource management in Star Wars CCG. You can have 50 cards in your hand, but if you don't have any cards in your life force, you lose. So obviously, you want to have cards in your hand. You need cards in your hand to play. But the more cards you take out of your life force and into your hand, the more you're depleting your own life force. So this is a fundamental element of resource management in Star Wars CCG, which is very interesting, that as a player, you learn how to do, and you make individual decisions about every game. So the other pile to point out here is the lost pile. Oh, that got big. Let me change that. And so, when your opponent makes you lose force, this is where those lost force go. And you can choose to lose force either out of your hand or out of your life force. And again, that's a strategic decision that you as a player make throughout the game. The other main way that cards end up in your lost pile is when you lose them from the table. So for example, when your characters on the table participate in a battle, typically some of them are going to end up being lost as a result of the battle, so they would go to the lost pile. Now, all these arrows here, from one pile to another, rather than just talking that through, let me show you what that would look like with some actual cards. So this is how it goes. So let's say I have some cards on the table here, I have some cards in my hand, and I have my reserve deck here. So with the flow of the force, at the start of my turn, I'll do what's called activating force. And so I'm going to take cards one at a time from my reserve deck and put them in my force pile. And the amount that I can do depends on factors which we'll discuss in later modules, but for now let's say I'm activating 4 force, okay? So I took 4 cards, one at a time, from my reserve deck and put them in my force pile. And these are the resources that I have available to use during my turn. So as I'm using resources, I take cards from my force pile and move them one at a time into my used pile. So let's say I'm using 3 force here. So 1, 2, 3. I've used 3 force. At the end of my turn, any cards in my used pile go back into my reserve deck. And unlike when I am activating or using force, when I recirculate, the whole pile goes at once, not one card at a time. So just like that. This is an important distinction for reasons which will become more clear in later modules, but just keep in mind for now. When you activate and use force, it's one at a time. when you recirculate, it is the whole pile at once. So let me actually return those cards here for a second. Let's say I have to lose force. I can choose where to lose force from any of the piles of my life force or from my hand. So I can take a card from my hand and put it in my lost pile. I can flip the top card of my reserve deck and put it in my lost pile, the top card of my used pile, or the top card of my force pile. If I have to lose multiple force, I can do any combination, right? So let's say I have to lose 2 force because of something my opponent did. I can choose a card from my hand and put it in my lost pile, decide I want to really keep the rest of the cards in my hand, and lose the second one, let's say, from my reserve deck. If I have to lose 3 force, I can lose the third one from my used pile, and so on. Bottom line, I can choose where each force I have to lose comes from. Now, a couple more key points about the flow of the force. If I want to draw more cards into my hand, those are going to come out of my force pile. So I can take a card one at a time from my force pile and put it in my hand. And we'll discuss in a later module at what specific point during your turn you would do that. However, a key thing to note is, if I do not draw this force in my force pile, it stays there, right? I get to the end of my turn and I recirculate. I still have that force there in my force pile. And when I get to my next turn and I activate more force, it's still there. And so by leaving force in my force pile, I accumulate resources to use in later turns. So again, resource management, I have to decide how to balance that against balancing the need to draw cards from my force pile into my hand in order to have a larger hand to work with. Finally, in a previous module, we mentioned the concept of drawing destiny. So when you draw destiny, you take the top card of your reserve deck, flip it over, use the destiny number, in this case it's a 4, then you put the card face down in your used pile. So that's the other way that cards flow around in your life force.